Dustbowl Diatribes is a Maurin Academy podcast.
I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Today we have Professor Jodi Dean. She's a professor of political science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and she's published numerous books, but the most recent one is Capital's Grave, Neofeudalism, and the New Class Struggle. It's just barely published with Verso Books, just been out about a month. A while ago, we read your piece in the LA Review of Books of the concept of neofeudalism as a way to describe our current economy and social arrangements. And so with this new book, we're really happy to have the chance to talk to you about your ideas and how they've developed. So welcome. And I guess, do you want to say anything more about yourself before we get started?
Well, I really appreciate you all having me on, and it's great to talk to people who've been thinking a lot about neo-feudalism.
Cool. Well, great to have you. So I get the term neo-feudalism implies, I think, that capitalism is not the system that we are in. So I guess maybe the place to start would be there with just, are we still in capitalism? If we're not, or if we're in some sort of modification, when did capitalism end, and what exactly are we in now as far as you're concerned?
The way I think about it is that capitalism is turning itself into something else. So we're still in capitalism, but capitalism is changing itself. One way to think about this is using the idea of transition. If we think about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, this lasted for hundreds of years. It wasn't like all of a sudden overnight there's capitalism, and here's a 5-year period and feudalism is gone and capitalism arises. The transition takes a long time, and it takes different forms in different places. So I think that we need to be attuned to the ways that capitalism is changing itself. And the way I think about these changes is its own laws of motion are coming into conflict with themselves and turning into something else. So, for example, one of the ways that Marxists think about capital's laws of motion is in terms of competition, the perpetual push to accumulate, the need to make improvements and reinvestments in order to accumulate, that these improvements in some ways are improvements in efficiency, but capitalism is always having to, you have to do particular things as a capitalist. Capitalists aren't just like free to do whatever they want. To be capitalists, they're pushed to act in particular ways. The neo-feudal hypothesis, as I see it, is that capitalism's push to accumulate is actually pushing it now into doing things that aren't particularly capitalist. Like they're not reinvesting, they're eating their proceeds. They're not pursuing different kinds of, they're not investing in production. They're taking up rents. They're not interested in developing new things. They're interested in trashing things and accumulating what's left. So I think looking at this kinds of like hoarding and plunder and destruction, and also rents more than profits, lets us start to see accumulation strategies that look much more like feudalism than they do like capitalism. So capitalism is going on, but we've got two sets of laws of motion that are increasingly sort of enveloping and conflicting with one another. And I think the feudal ones are becoming more and more dominant. If you just look at things like the ways that profits accruing to rents and finance are exceeding those that accrue from investment and production, then we can start to get a shape of these things, right? It's less and less commodity production and more rents and intellectual property. So in sum, the basic idea is that, yes, we're in capitalism, but capitalism is transforming. And this transformation could take, 10, 20, 30 years. It could take 100 years. It could have been, we could say it's been happening over 10 years or 20 or 30 years, depending on what we want to highlight. Because whenever you're looking at transitions, you're seeing some things that are the same and some things that are different, but recognizing that things don't just remain the same all the time.
Right. So, I mean, what was that point or trigger? I mean, I hear you that there's no like one point in time that you can point to, but what is triggering these changes? I mean, if you had to characterize it, for instance, in the past, we have busted monopolies, we have like fought back against corruption, we have sort of stimulated the economy with greater welfare programs and redistribution if necessary and so on. But now we're seeing, I agree with you, there's more like just extraction going on and vast amounts of wealth accumulating in the hands of a few people. What caused that? Why this turn?
I think that's a complicated and long question. One thing that I don't mean the answer would have to be complicated and long, not the question. One thing we could say is that neo-feudalism is the effect of 40 years of neoliberalism. That it's the effect of efforts to move the state out of the business of social welfare and social provisioning and to increase the role of the private sector. It's and that I think of as in part a kind of fragmentation, right? A getting rid of the state in some areas, letting that become more, instead of having one kind of state set of provisions for welfare, as we know, many of the welfare mechanisms were dispersed onto the states, the several states. That would be kind of one example of this sort of fragmentation. So we've got this neo-feudalizing present because of 40 years of neoliberalism, and the change in the state that come about the change in the state that brings about. We have it, I think, also because of the economic change towards an economy of services. And that's a global phenomenon. It's not just in the US. I mean, worldwide, the majority of workers are in services rather than, actually productive labor in the old school Marxist sense. So the rise of services and the concomitant rise of a particular kind of technology that is enveloping us in all sorts of new forms of unfreedom. And I kind of think that it's this new experience of different kinds of unfreedom that has made the language of neo-feudalism so attractive to people, right? They feel they use the language as like, oh, we're like serfs all over again. Like, how come? So I think this combination of effects of neoliberalism, changes in the state, imposition of technology and rise of services has created this kind of neo-feudalizing present.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, you're using feudalism primarily as kind of an analogy. You're not saying in some straightforward way we're just reverting back to pre-capitalist feudalism. You're saying it is a new mode of production. We're just using this terminology analogically. Is that right?
Well, what I want to try to weasel my way through your different points. So I want to say that it's more than an analogy. And maybe less than a mode of production. So I want to, that's why I want to use this language of neo-feudalism. So I think you're totally right. We're not reverting. It's like everybody all of a sudden didn't become a peasant on the land. We don't own our means of subsistence, or we don't even work for a lord that particularly is going to supply us with means of subsistence. That's not what's happening. So it would seem really, it would be a mistake to just say that we're reverting to something like feudalism. I think that instead, what's happening is capitalism is developing and pushing through in this way that that has tendencies that were like the old feudalism. And that's why I want to call it neo-feudalism. The majority of workers in the United States have to work in order to get their means of subsistence, right? It's not like they have easy access to it, right? They have to work for a wage and purchase their means of subsistence in some way. So to act as if they're just serfs again would be incorrect. But yet there's a different kind of unfreedom with the things that they're required to do, the things that they cannot avoid doing, the kinds of rents and fines and fees that perpetually entrap them, that feel different from just the forms of subservience that we had under simply wage labor, right? There's a new layer of forms of oppression seems a little too strong. Capture might be right. Extraction, I think, or expropriation might be the better terms there.
And so how would you say, you've been writing about this for several years, starting, I think the first time you publicly talked about it was in the LA Review of Books article. Is that right? And I guess how would you say your thinking has deepened since then?
Actually, no. I had a piece, and I think the journalist called it may have changed its name, New Political Science, probably the year before. And so it was around, must have been 2018 or 2019, I started talking about this in a few different lectures, like the American Political Science Association, and also a lecture in the Netherlands, and an architecture meeting in, I think it was in Scotland. So I'd been talking about it. I've been doing the research and thinking about it for a year or so, maybe a couple of years before that. What's changed, I think, what changed in the last few years is I did a kind of deeper dive into Marx's discussion in the Grundrisse and like Volume 3 of Capital and these kinds of sort of semi-nerdy things. And what was important for me, particularly in the Grundrisse, was how in the Grundrisse, Marx's account of the origins of capitalism is much different from what he has in Capital Volume 1, right? In Capital Volume 1, we have the famous story of primitive accumulation, and it seems like a set of violent upheavals that you can, even there it takes, over 100 years, but it seems much more action-oriented. In the Grundrisse, it's this long, slow process of separation, right? The separation of workers or workers from the land and from the instruments of labor over time, and it just kind of it comes about really gradually. And it was this kind of long process of separation that I thought was interesting, because he has these formulations like and everything that was present at the beginning is present at the end, but in a different form. So you've got, land and tools and workers, but how they relate to one another is different in the kind of, fantastic, pre-capitalist time from where it ends up after capitalism. For example, like under capitalism, we never really think about the fact that, oh, people have to go out and work, but how are they getting the food and shelter they need before they have the wages that they've earned? Like, where does that come from? When I talk to my students, I sometimes talk about how, you know, in some ways you have to be privileged after you graduate from college to get a job, because how are you paying your rent and living to get a job if you don't have something, right? But we kind of under capitalism, we tend to tell the story too late. Like, oh, workers earn the money that they need for their rent and their food, but they had to have rent and food first before they could earn the money. And so there's these things that are a kind of natural whole prior to capitalism. Capitalism separates and puts them in a different relation. So this idea of separation was something I kept thinking about with in the present, thinking like, God, now it's not even like you have to have more and more things in order to get a job. We're separated more and more from, we're basically separate from markets, right? You don't buy most things, we don't buy directly anymore. We go through more and more different layers of intermediaries to access them. These intermediaries all take a cut of some sort, even if it's, I mean, the most minimal cut is they just get to keep our data and do stuff with it. But other kinds of cuts that they take are various sorts of fees and, you know, and fines and all of this kind of stuff. So it was this kind of the separation and mediation that he talks about in the Grundrisse that made me, you know, I felt was like relevant for the present and helped think about the new kinds of unfreedom that we experience, that I think, you know, is sort of underpinning why feudal language is popular and does underpin my sort of theorization of neo-feudalism.
So a couple of just add-ons to that. You know, one of the things that I see a lot is people are now like required to buy their own like tools that they use for their work. Either, you know, driving their car if they're an Uber driver, or like if they're an IT person, they literally have to buy their own computer. It's not a, you know, it's not expected that the employee will buy that. So, I mean, this is one thing I see all the time, and I wonder what you thought about that. And then the other thing is that, you know, it seems like our reputation and our relationships matter more, like relationships of loyalty and personal relationships in our employment more than they used to. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on either one of those two observations.
I think those are both super interesting and important observations. You know, you mentioned Uber. Uber's such a great example. This is a driver service that doesn't own cars. Right? It's a transportation service that is only, you know, kind of a predatory leeching insertion. That's it. Right? They didn't create new ways of driving. They didn't create better cars. They didn't create faster cars, right? All they did was insert themselves so that they could create markets that bring together riders and drivers. But they don't own the cars, right? The cars belong to the riders, who are utterly dependent now on Uber more and more, and they have to work more hours, or they lose their place in line, right? They won't get the notifications. They won't, you know, all of the different kind of constraints that they get from the app are pretty horrifying when you think about it. So yeah, I absolutely agree. And we think about all sorts of like delivery drivers. They got to have the phone. They got to have the bicycle or motorbike. Yeah. So the companies that employ them don't provide the means of production or the means of service. On the loyalty part, I think that's really, really important. In the book, Capital's Grave, Neofeudalism and the New Class Struggle, I have this example from Paul Krugman talking about Trump and people subservient to Trump and their kind of practices of loyalty and deference. And what just kills me in it is Krugman seems like utterly nonplussed. Like he doesn't. I use the wrong word. That Krugman seems to take for granted the fact that underlings would be subservient, right? He takes for granted this structure of deference and loyalty. He just thinks that if you surround yourself by people who are deferent to you, you won't get good ideas. But he takes it for granted rather than saying, oh my God, wait a minute, this is a workplace where that's what is assumed. And the even though the stuff that we're talking about, definitely exceeds and precedes Trump, we get this example in spades of like this extreme version where loyalty is what counts the most. I think we've been seeing this in popular culture for a while, right? Like Game of Thrones, of course, but also Secession, all about different ties of loyalty, and also that within a family, a family dynasty setup, and this personalization of work also seems very much like the kind of it's like a feudal process because it's a dependent on personal relationship rather than public law, right? Rather than rules that apply the same way to everyone. It depends on your individual ties and relationships, and that's what matters for, basically your compensation, your security, etc.
And just taking that a step further, do you feel like the administration's actions in the last few months has like further proved your hypothesis that neo-feudalism is a thing?
Yeah, I think so. I think that if, for example, if all of the great welfare state provisions that were passed as emergency COVID measures had stayed in place, then it might be like, oh, I guess, we beat these tendencies. The tendencies to neo-feudalism that are present are not so strong. In fact, we've got countervailing tendencies that are so much better. But unfortunately, it seems like right now, these neo-feudalizing tendencies are getting stronger by the day.
They're taking away the layer of the bureaucracy that deals with fairness and objectivity in, say, employment and workplace, because they want to replace it with personal loyalty relationships. So the analogy of kind of like the king and the nobles and the vassals kind of looks all too good here, actually. Thoughts on, just on why, or how you see that kind of almost decapitation of the old bureaucracy?
Capital wanted to shake the fetters from the state, right? It wanted to shake off those fetters and have free reign. I like very much Quinn Slobodian's book. What's the name of it? He talks about zones, cracked capitalism or cracked up capitalism. And one of the things that he traces in there is a lot of the language of the libertarian right and their infatuation with Banustans and Hong Kong and these different sort of city-states with what is it called? Prospera in Honduras, this very large kind of free trade or some sort of, free zone where free only means free from state intervention, state law, and free for kinds of unfettered capitalism, kind of contract communities. So his book is a lot about these different kinds of zones. And those, I think, are really indicative of the tendencies in contemporary neo-feudalism, these kinds of fragmentation. I think I lost track of your question, though. Wait, can you go back to your question? Sorry, because I got enthusiastic about my example.
No, I think you're kind of in the zone there, because those new zones they're all about like bypassing all the regulations and whatever the country they are in, and just running it like it's a suzerainty or something like that, right?
Exactly right.
And so, yeah, it just seems like here in the United States, the positions that they're most like aimed at getting rid of are those positions that actually watchdog positions or positions that deal with making sure that there's objectivity within the system as far as how people are hired or how like grants are made or how, people get their aid, so that they can be replaced with more personalistic and feelings-based kind of decision making. That reminds me of the feudal order, to be sure. And so I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts were on the state of the U.S. bureaucracy and whether this is going to like speed up the process of neo-feudalization.
I'm afraid that it will, to be really honest. I mean, it's the continued. I mean, one of the things that's wild to me is the elimination of funding for medicine and science and like really hardcore scientific research that benefits everyone, right? That benefits the world. I was asking, I was, talking with different people over a meal and saying like, the U.S. government has paid for, U.S. taxpayers for, I don't know, over 50 years has invested in research and development in ways that have benefited the entire world, right? Whether or not we want to talk about health or the space program or even the internet. I mean, all sorts of contributions to science that have been better for the whole world. Why? And that meant that like the private sector didn't have to do it, right? So why would the private sector want to take on that R&D burden when it could have been, or it has been, the U.S. taxpayer or the U.S. government has been paying for all that R&D? And someone, who was around was saying like, oh, it's because the biggest ones, right, like Google and Meta and Elon Musk, like the billionaires have accumulated so much that they don't need to worry about that anymore, right? They're already on the top. Like Google has more money than it can ever possibly spend, and so they don't see a benefit any longer in publicly funded research. They think that they can do it, and that they will, I mean, the thing, but it just seems so maddening because they already profit from it, right? Like the pharmaceutical sector profits from public investment, and yet still they get private profit from it. But it seems to be the case that, the billionaire class or the class of asset holders no longer finds it worthwhile to have public investment in science.
Yeah, now they want to monopolize that. Elon Musk's space program, an ideal example of that. He and Bezos, to a much smaller, have taken over the U.S. space program and a lot of the research accompanying it, and have just spent billions and billions, right? So now we contract with them, as I understand it, for an awful lot of what we do.
We contract with them, yeah.
Yeah, right. So now they have this monopoly. So yeah, I think it is concerning because that public research is a democratizing influence that not only benefits them, but it benefits a lot of other startup type companies and people in general, rather than just the few. So that's a major loss.
How would you slot in climate change into this looming neo-feudal future? Like, I assume, again, the answer is going to be things aren't trending in a positive direction. But
definitely, things are not trending in a positive direction at all. However, one of the, like, my primary or secondary, a key argument that I make in Capital's Grave is that, in fact, we need to see in the present, and we can see in the present, a path out, a kind of a horizon, a way maybe to win, and that's in the service sector. And so I try to be, sort of dialectical about it. Well, it's the case that we have that the majority of jobs in the world are now in services, understood really broadly, but it means that the majority of jobs are not in industrial production. So the majority of jobs are in services. We also know on a warming planet, we cannot reindustrialize the United States. Like, that would be a mistake. In fact, what needs to happen in places that are not fully industrialized is to figure out better ways to support them in in ways that they can live high quality lives without having to go through an industrial phase like the United States and the quote unquote global North went through. So if we recognize then that industry is not going to be the way, and that the majority of people are in services, then we can start to think about what will an economy and a society on a warming planet have to look like. It will have to look like services done for one another rather than services of a billionaire owning class, right? It has to be an expansion of services. It has to be a recognition that that like serving the planet, serving like with wetlands restoration and forms of more responsible agriculture, that we have to have an approach that recognizes in the sector of servants a new vanguard class, that they can usher in a kind of economy and set of relations that are suitable for a warming planet and that can help us actually respond to and adapt to a warming planet. So I think we have to take it as a given feature of our life, the fact of climate change and the destruction it's bringing about. That's just a fact. We can't pretend it's elsewhere. And any of these sort of crazy, sort of like, I don't know, what are the different names, like carbon seeding? Is that what it is? Or cloud seeding? These sort of terrible techno things. That's a horrible dystopian future. I think I read today or yesterday that in the UK government has authorized some of these sort of cloud seeding experiments to try to, because they need more clouds and rain in England, but but those kinds of techno solutions are not the way. But what we have to do is, of course, decarbonize and then adapt the economies in ways that are focused on services, like serving the planet, health, education, green space, that kind of thing. So I think that what we do on a warming planet is actually embrace, democratize, support, expand, nurture, respect services.
Does that kind of go along with degrowth, with the concept of degrowth or not? What's your feeling about that whole school of thought?
To be really honest, I try to avoid the degrowth debate because I always feel like the parameters of it are capitalist and a capitalist economy. And I think when you move into a socialist or communist approach, your emphasis is on meeting needs. And that's the metric that you use is how do you meet needs? And so how do you meet the needs of people and the planet, particularly under conditions of climate change? And so growth just sort of, I hope I can just sidestep it by saying that's not the primary question.
Mm-hmm. But something like it would be baked into the kind of the world you would like to live in.
Something like
a degrowth.
I think we need to, grow. I mean, it depends on what do you want to grow and
Right.
how are you measuring what counts as growth? And in a communist future, it's going to be understood differently. It's like, can we meet more needs? Right? Do we have increased needs for like culture or learning how we nurture one another, or appreciating multiple ways of different multiple ways of, I don't know, arranging plants or something. But I say this is why I really try to steer clear. I think that the growth framework is limiting.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, and this is a good segue to towards the end of the book, you critique kind of localist, communitarian, at some point you call them neo-feudal leftists. And where it hit home for me is like, I don't know if you can hear, but I have like sheep and ducks making noise in the background, and I'm inside of Kansas City, Missouri. And I also feel alienated from like the surrounding local food scene because I'm like, guys, we are not, a lot of people in this scene, they imagine themselves as like social democrats or further to the left. And I'm like, we don't even have functional farms that are like making money. And And so we're going to just slot right in with some sort of techno-feudal dystopia that's coming. I guess can you expand on your critique of that and how perhaps in a world where we really let the service sector flourish, how these scenes could be redeemed, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments, Spencer. You know, the first thing that I would say, well, let me step back a second. So years ago, right before the Occupy movement, I gave a talk in Brooklyn where, it was the kind of, I don't know, like the heyday of that kind of hipster scene of, oh, all we need to do is, have chickens in Brooklyn and, our own gardens and all of this kind of stuff. And I'm just like, look, Goldman Sachs doesn't care if you raise chickens, right? This was like, it just seemed like that's not what is going to bring down Wall Street, for Christ's sake. But yet, I think what I would say now is the kinds of skills and talents of knowing how to plant things and grow things, knowing what a healthy chicken eats and how to keep chickens healthy, having a relationship to one's food and the land is really important. These are indispensable skills that need to be expanded. And I think more and more of us need to learn how to grow food that in a I think no matter what's going to happen in a world with a changing climate, we're going to have to spend more time in agriculture. More people and work are going to have to be in agriculture. The question is it going to be done under forms of servitude, or is it going to be done under forms of sort of community and joy and participation and sharing and equality rather than being forced? I think that So there is a nice kind of vanguard aspect of some of the the kind of agrarian hipster scene, but it doesn't substitute for seizing the state, and it's not going to on the micro level as fulfilling as it might be. It's not a way to respond to what's happening, because it doesn't scale, right? Like it won't change the trajectory of the climate just to have, 5 or 6 people in every community who have their own farms. I mean, I live in Geneva, New York, right? We're surrounded by soy crops, lots of pumpkins, cabbages, lots of farmers. I mean, lots of tomatoes. I mean, everybody's a member of a CSA. I mean, this is great. And it's also an impoverished area. It's not that the fact that there are CSAs, that doesn't mean that the majority of people eat well. It just doesn't, right? We're gonna have to have a restructuring of the state and the economy on a massive level. And so we can learn from the smaller efforts, but we shouldn't be deluded.
Right. And I guess my follow-up to that would be, I've slowly, as I've learned urban farming is not a viable career option, I've shifted over time, gradually basically into the real estate market. So first it was farming, then that was the gateway to landscaping, and then I turned into being a contractor. And I'm keenly attuned to, like, when I'm having discussions with people on the job, I'm like looking for glimmers of a socialist consciousness. And occasionally you'll find someone with what Lenin called trade union consciousness, but I have never encountered any normal person that could follow the discussion that we're having right now.
Really?
Yeah, and maybe that's a Midwestern thing. Yeah, please tell me it's a Midwestern thing, or tell me it's who I'm associating with, and help pull me out of my kind of funk in that regard, my listlessness and hopelessness.
So I think I'm really surprised because when you say the discussion we're having right now, you mean the entire discussion we've had, for the last 30, 40 minutes about neo-feudalism, that no everyday normal person, that this would mean absolutely nothing. We could just be having it in Chinese.
No,
I
I
don't
think
believe that.
yeah. Okay, let me distinguish. The kind of the affect of it and the way that people experience that definitely. The discussion about modes of production or yeah, the discussion about modes of production needing to have solidarity to seize somewhere you say at the end we need to seize the state, abolish private property, facilitate social reproduction. That no. Hating your boss, yes. Teaming up with your co-employers to like replace the boss. Uh, I haven't encountered that, but
Except for trade union consciousness, you've encountered.
I've seen a bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as you well know, Lenin thought that political consciousness has to come in from the outside, and that in what that meant for him is it comes in from the party, right? That the role of the socialist or communist party is to try to raise political consciousness, to provide a way to understand the different things that people are experiencing in the world, to kind of make sense of why is it the case that some people are rich and some people are poor? Why is it the case that the hardest workers never seem to get ahead? Why is it the case that, you know, one guy can own more than like 6 countries? Like that's nutso. And I think my experience is that people can understand that. The question's going to be is like, do they want to? And not everybody wants to have a political conversation. But super interestingly, right now, is I think we're seeing across the United States more and more people who like would never protest are going out in the streets because they're so upset by what Trump and Musk are doing. I mean, it's been so wild to me. Like the woman who cuts my hair was telling me, she's like, I never watch the news. I've been watching it all the time. I hate what they're doing. She's like, my Republican friends, I'm not talking to them anymore. We're going for a recession because Trump's producing it and they won't even listen to me. But she's not a political person. She's just like, I am mad. And she is starting to notice protest. My kid's Latin teacher was like, she's like, actually her parents were farmers and became Republicans after Jimmy Carter's disastrous farm policies. And so she grew up very angry about the Democrats. She's out there protesting with a sign. Right, like even putting, she and her husband are putting pictures on Facebook about protesting. These are not a kind of typical leftist, but they're mad. This is I think we've got a real opportunity in the United States right now, as people are seeing that the concentration of wealth at the top, their willingness to actually seize the state for their own benefit, their willingness to cut veterans affairs, to threaten Social Security, all the states now that are going to try to make Medicaid dependent on work. Like folks understand this and can see this. What they are going to want to know is how do we fight back? And that's where we need to give messages about organizing and coming together. So not everybody's going to understand every aspect of a mode of production discussion at the beginning, but maybe after a couple of months they might want to.
Maybe you're right. Yeah. And I loved your quote in the book about maybe it's better to say that challenging the order of death is a form politics takes in neo-feudal times. I think that dovetails with what you're saying, that as the situation gets more dire, at least there will be protesting and then enter the question of raising political consciousness. But sorry, go ahead, Laurie.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, where I really have an obstacle to imagining the ultimate transition to a better system. It just lies with human nature itself. I mean, what I've seen is when people get riled up and maybe they like coalesce for a while, but then as soon as things get a little bit better, they just forget about it. And also I've seen where like-minded people want to organize and they all say they share the same values, but then their relations literally fall apart because they can't even get along with each other. So like I'm having the hardest time, and I wish, and Spencer and I are both Christians, so there's also kind of like we have a certain amount of Christian vision of what people could be too. But in both cases, it's real hard for me to imagine the people that I've encountered throughout my life being capable of organizing a sort of like a more beneficial socialist society than maybe democratic socialism, which we see has occurred and fairly successfully in some countries. But beyond that, so I guess what gives you hope? And I mean, how would you address people like me who are just kind of like, we can't really imagine it?
I've got a couple of responses. One is I actually very much think people can change and transformation is possible. My aunt and uncle lived in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and they were very, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Southern white people, and they're Episcopalian. And they were, particularly my uncle was not a friend of the gays. He was pretty homophobic. And then when the Episcopal Church made the call that, yes, they would ordain Episcopal bishops and they would welcome same-sex couples into the church and that they would marry them, the priests gave a bunch of different classes at the church. And my uncle's like, okay, if that's what, where my church goes, I go there too. And I really appreciated that coming from him. Like, I thought that was it was a huge step. One of the things that attracted me to communism was growing up in the South in a Southern Baptist. My aunt and uncle were Episcopalian. When I was a child, my parents were Southern Baptist. And, so I read in the book of Acts that there was something like, and the apostles distributed their goods according to need, to one another, each according to their need. And I looked around me and I saw that's not what this church is doing or preaching, but this strikes me as as the right way to distribute things. And so it seems like it's a message at the core of Christianity. And I think, Pope Francis definitely tried to bring that message out. We're recording this, 2 days after he died, which is still, I think a terrible, terrible loss. So I actually think that communism is at the core of a Christian message, and that the possibility of change and working together is actually what the church is people coming together in ways that are not exploitative, not expropriative, not about oppression or manipulation, but about something larger.
Yeah, it's one of the interesting facts in 2025 is that it was a mainstream American thing to be discussing the Ordo Amoris, like the fact that we're using these Latin terms about universal charity. Yeah, I agree with you, and I halfway agree with you. I agree with you that we have this call to universal love, and then there's also at least this traditional doctrine of sin and fallenness and finitude, and it's how do you navigate those two things? And one of my favorite parts of your book was when you talk about the everyday psychosis of catastrophic anxiety. Could you talk a bit about that and how that kind of impacts? I feel like to some extent that's what Laurie and I were both venting about, that we're all carrying our psychic baggage and the people we've encountered are carrying it. So I guess, can you speak to that?
So there's a lot to say about that. In the book, I developed this, with psychoanalytic theory, like the most obscure kinds of psychoanalytic theory coming from Jacques Lacan, which I don't think would be readily absorbable by your imaginary Midwestern interlocutors there. Yeah, all the Jutons, but
they experience it. But sorry, go ahead.
But in general, the idea is that we feel buttressed by forces beyond our control all the time that we can't make sense of, and that we see other people also buttressed, but we also experiencing them as intrusions on us and as threats to us. And we don't have and the part that makes it psychotic is that there's not this third symbolic place that can navigate our sense that the other is a threat or a rival and our mutual fears. Right. So the church is one place that tries to do this, but it only provides that third perspective for those within it. The same would be something like the Communist Party, only provides the perspective for those within it, or maybe fellow travelers. I mean, even for those who've been talking a lot about Catholic doctrine in the mainstream, it can sort of be just like they talk about, alien abduction, or here's what these other people believe. It doesn't mean they feel the force of it. So it's this absence of this symbolic place, this third space, or part of the language is a big other, or we could say it's the absence of an order of law that we accept and that we can use to navigate our fears or anxieties about other people, or our sense that everyone is a threat to us, or that their every utterance is like something that makes us vulnerable. Right? There's one of the things that's characteristic of the present is this strange politics around language, where people get more upset about words that are used than they do about actual things that are happening in the world. And this is part of the ways that people feel really vulnerable. It's like there's no extra place where, okay, here's meaning and language, and that's separate. It's like it's all collapsed. And the language, the theoretical language that I use is like, this would be the collapse of the symbolic so that the imaginary and the real blur together. So it is like a feudal order where there's monsters, right? There's real monsters around us. Like we can be afraid of monsters. It's like you touch someone and they might turn into a leprechaun, or you can turn anything into gold. Like there's not an order of science and law and reason that separates everything. So this is, and in a time of catastrophe, the catastrophe is real, but science is getting dismantled, right? Where one of the things that's crazy to me about some of the stuff the Trump administration is doing is getting like defunding in part the National Aeronautics and Weather Service. Right. What in the world? Like stop weather reports during climate change? Like, why would they do that? Right. Then so that you only will get right-wing weather reports and left-wing weather reports, or pay, like I'll pay for a good weather report. Like it makes no sense. But it's so this again, I hope I'm giving like at least the feel or the vibe of this kind of catastrophic anxiety, this sort of general sense of psychotic catastrophism that we find ourselves, swimming in.
Mm-hmm.
Would another word be for this just be authority, loss of a sense of authority? There's no like the big other as a kind of an authority, right? That everybody respects, or that everybody that gives them the space to be able to see things more objectively and basically take a more of an independent stance. That's kind of how I'm relating to it. So tell me if I'm wrong, but also like, yes, whatever that is, I see that we've lost that and it's caused a great deal of confusion. How in the world can we get that back so that we could all see a solution to some of these problems?
I'm wondering to myself, like, why do I want to resist a bit the term authority? Because I think technically it's not. I think technically you're right. It is something like authority. It's what comes to my mind is like, I would rather say maybe authorization, in part because there's a tendency because basically we want it. It's not just the absence of authority, because clearly there's cops. Cops are real. And then there's the IRS, and that's real. And our bosses can fire us. So there's kinds of authority, but it all feels unauthorized. And so we could also maybe call it the loss of legitimacy. But maybe the loss of authorization, I think, or justification, the sense that anything that's happening to us is unjustified, which also I think is part of the outrage around Trump. Like what he's doing is really beyond the pale. And at least that gives some sense, like that people have a sense some things are justified and some things are not. But this battle with the courts is going to be pretty decisive on whether or not even a semblance or like, I don't know, fragmented areas of, justifiable legal authority will be there or not. If the courts cave, I think that we're in for a very sort of, long, dark winter, as it were. But how would we get it back? Honestly, I mean, I hate to say this, I think things are going to get worse before they get better. And it will be some kind of revolutionary change. Or just things get worse, the slow, steady decline or rapid decline into more and more fragmentation and despair. So people will have their isolated little communities where they have something like a common sense or a common set of beliefs, but these won't transfer at all. And it'll be this kind of feudalized sets of walled off mentalities, discourses, fortresses, worlds, with very little, very little interpenetration and so increased distrust, and violence. I mean, this is not a world that is amenable to peace very easily.
Right. Yeah, there's power and then there's authority, which I agree with you. I was thinking more in terms of legitimacy and justification. And that kind of authority is built on, seems to me, some sort of cultural pre-agreement that really isn't fully rational even. And we've just lost that. We just don't have it. Like there's no particular respect for anybody or anything just because, right? Whether it's people because they're older or because they have more education or because they've just got more experience. I mean, we've seen kind of the complete overturning of some of these values with, we get rid of the people with experience and we put in people who have no experience, right? And there's this just frontal assertion of power, like, as in come and see if you can stop me. And that's really kind of like it's the breakdown of societal agreement that is necessary for us to even have like peace. So I tend to agree that in the short run anyway, or probably for my entire rest of my life, we're going to be dealing with the effects of that disagreement. But I mean, hopefully, with enough suffering. I mean, it's weird to say. I hope that's not the case, but that's kind of where I go, is like with enough suffering, people sort of come to a little bit and decide that they have to. I was just showing my students the old footage of the collapse of Soviet communism. And, that was an oppressive system. It wasn't what any of us would consider real communism at that point. And, you had like thousands and millions of people just, they would not go home until they overthrew it. The result wasn't like perfect, far from it, but they galvanized enough courage to do that. And when people get really hard pressed, they can do something like that. So that's probably the type of conditions that we'll have to live through for that to happen.
Alas, that's probably true. I probably have a slightly different take on the former Soviet Union than you do. I think in part the fragmentation and rupture there had a lot to do with U.S. pressures and the U.S. Funding of these color revolutions and its encouragement of the Soviet Union to put a great deal of money into defense rather than into their consumer sector, even as they were trying to, to develop better. I mean, I think, I don't like, to engage in hypothetical history, but it's one could imagine what if after World War II there had been an effort to have sort of solidarity across different systems rather than a new Cold War. What might have happened there, or even, because I mean, it didn't have to go as badly as it did. It really didn't.
No, I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that we had a hand in creating those conditions and pushing them off course. But just looking at how people can respond when
Yeah.
they really, I mean, that's kind of where I was going with that comment, is you do see people can muster up the courage and conviction if they really have to.
I think that's right. And I hope that the protests that we're seeing out in the streets now, right? The attacks on the Tesla dealerships and sites, the just people who would not normally protest going out weekend after weekend, that this is going to have effects, right? Millions of people in the streets has effects. And is it gonna, what I mean, I think we can also think, the Depression and World War II were bad, and there was a response, right? The United States can sometimes respond to things pretty quickly. I mean, maybe something about our kind of impatience as a people might, in a kind of trying to be more optimistic sense, maybe it'll work this time. And I think what it's going to take is, will some of the protests lead more people empowered to either make stupid decisions that add to more protests, or to actually start having some better rupture in the political class that creates more space. But I think we have to think it's possible, right? I think we have to think it's possible, that we don't have a luxury of despair.
Could you flesh out a bit more? Let's very hypothetical futuring. Let's say this book goes totally viral, everybody wakes up to it. What would you like to see as like a sort of alternate trajectory? Yes, like the sort of the nationalization of the service sector, and you talk about how you really want universal basic services.
Oh yeah.
Could you lay out the future you would like to call us towards?
So this will be hard. I won't do it as a roadmap, because I just can't. And also, it should be top secret, this roadmap, because I don't want the bad guys to know the plans. But I will talk a little bit about universal basic services. In part because on the left, people have picked up the right-wing idea of universal basic income as some kind of egalitarian demand. And it's just like, oh, if everybody had a kind of guaranteed income, then we wouldn't need things like Social Security or any kinds of temporary assistance for needy families. And people would just buy what they needed and wanted, and they would have more freedom because they have control over their money. Well, what that means is, and there's been different experiments with this, it's not, and for the most part, it's offered as a substitute for something like welfare or Social Security rather than as a supplement. But let's just say, but either way, this putting money in individuals' hands idea presupposes a commodity economy. It presupposes that people are purchasing what they need to survive. Right? It does not presuppose that they own their own means of subsistence, or that they are part of large-scale social or even small-scale social groups that need to provide for one another. It's a very individualistic way of thinking, and I don't think that can let people mentally go in a socialist direction. Universal basic services takes another part of our reality, which is namely, people kind of assume that the state should provide public education, even though that's in some places under threat. We think of some minimal degree of public education as a state responsibility, some degree of clean air and clean water, though again, that's under threat. Roads, some degree of protection from, you know, natural disasters, right? Like what FEMA comes in, that the state actually provides a lot of services. And then if we could even take another step, we would say, oh, things like, you know, libraries, that's a public service. You know, national parks. These are things that people have a kind and most and you know civilized countries also healthcare is in there and some degree of support for public housing, but we're not quite a civilized country, so we don't have those things. But we can recognize that there is an expectation of services that are available to everyone, right? Not just my yard, but a park where everybody in the community can go, right? Not just like, you know, everyone can go see Niagara Falls or something like this, and it's not just private. If we start thinking in terms of the provision of basic services, then we immediately move in a socializing direction, because we think about not what do I want and what can I buy, but what does my community need? What does my neighborhood need? What does my country need? What does my state need? What does the world need? So I would like to see as a kind of program the recognition of the service sector as a vanguard class, and that what they need to make as one of their primary demands is universal basic services. So it's people providing services like healthcare, education, wetland restoration, all these kinds of basic services, and the demand for basic services. I think that that can push us, even if it's, you know, a little bit abstract, it can push us in a direction of that we need to imagine for socialism. Right? It lets us think about class struggle without having to focus on struggles at the point of production, like a strike. But when we think about like a lot of struggles around, like with healthcare struggles or teacher struggles, are both point of production, right? Nurses striking, teachers striking, but they also spread out into the community that involves like students and parents and everyone around them, or patients and families. So there are interesting things about these kinds of struggles is that they involve a large number of people in them. You can also think of a lot of ecological struggles, I think, as service sector class struggles, in part because they want the public or the state or the nation to be responsible for the environment. So it's a call for a kind of service to the planet. So I think that's the way to go, right? In a de-individualizing way, in a collectivizing way, with our understanding of class struggle on a warming planet.
Would we work less? You know, we've talked to people lately that have been, you know, people work too long, too hard. They don't have any energy left to do anything else with their lives. In your better world, would we work, say, half time or 2/3 time, or what do you envision?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think of all of this stuff I'm saying about universal basic services as within a larger kind of communist program of collectivizing the means of production, elimination of private property, centralized planning. And I think that within that, and particularly if we understand centralized planning in a kind of participatory, back and forth way, where workers, producers, communities, figure out what they need and want, and what they can do and offer, and then this kind of information gets put into a larger plan that then there's lots of feedback loops, in this imaginary. I think most of us would want to work less, but I think we also would change what we think about as work, right? Like, I don't know, for y'all, is doing the podcast work? Right? Do you consider this doing work? Or is this like, do you work in order to do the podcast? Right? Like, for academics, what exactly, like, what we're paid to do, a lot of what we like to do, and that's part of our job, is not really what we're paid to do. And our pay is generally like really disconnected from where we spend most of our time. So I know for most activists, right, like, we work incredible hours, but the work is not pay. The work is for, I don't know, for the revolution. The work is for the struggle. So I think in addition to kind of working less at things we don't like to do, we'll find that a lot of the jobs that are out there are unnecessary. A lot of the jobs that are out there are busy work, and that maybe we'll also have a different relationship to our work, so it won't feel as bad. It won't feel as immiserating and grueling and disrespected. So I think that we have to understand the transformation of work as huge, right? It's not just going to be about time. It's going to be about dignity and respect and enjoyment and our relationships to doing the things that we want to do. You guys probably said this a billion times on your podcast, but there's these great lines in the German ideology where Marx is like, oh, and under communism, I can like hunt in the morning and fish in the afternoon and be a critical critic in the evening or something like this. But it's kind of great because it's like, look, imagining a rich life where we do multiple different things that today might get pigeonholed as a job.
And you talk in the book that your concern is that by framing neo-feudalism, there's a danger that some people will feel a pull to, therefore we need to defend neoliberal capitalism or some other prior state. That is one danger. But then the flip side of it is when you see how bad neo-feudalism is potentially going to be, what if instead of just hedging our bets, we like go for broke, if that makes sense?
Hedging, instead of hedging our bets, we go for broke for communism?
Something like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's basically the wager I want people to, whether or not people are convinced completely, I want them to come away with the sense that, we really are at a crossroads of neo-feudalism or communism. We actually can't go back to capitalism. That's what I would say the political mainstream in the United States, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, want people to think that we can do, is that they, clearly the Trump administration wants us to have some kind of vision that we're going to have, I don't know exactly what period, but some kind of industries and mines that are going to be good, which is weird. Like nobody ever thought that mining was like a wonderful, wonderful job. People thought it was part of their life and history that they had to do, and they got dignity from it. But this is hard, terrible work, right? Like very, very hard, difficult work. It should not come back in this climate. So to think that we're going to go back to, so one hand, there's a promise that we can go back to capitalism, but that promise occludes how bad it was, and also it's a lie. Right? If we could go back, we wouldn't be where we were. We would have stayed there. But no, things have changed. Technology has changed, right? The technology has moved people out of those kinds of jobs. It's unless the program is going to be smash all the technology, then there's no going back. And I think that the Democratic promise is something like, if we just get Trump out of office, things will be fine again, because that was the same thing that they ran before. But that's not going to be true. But that's not going to stop the larger neo-feudalizing process of billionaires and small sector of billionaires and large service sector class. I mean, that part is, that's economically there. And one side thing, I think we made this point earlier, but I want to make sure that we keep it in mind. I mean, this does change how people relate to one another, right? Folks end up thinking that the rich are somehow better and entitled. People practice subservience. I mean, I had a friend of mine is a waitress in town, and she ran for city council. And she came very close, like within 1 or 2 votes of winning for city council. And she said that that one of the things that really got her is that the same people who might be kind of nice to her when she was like at a political event, like, Democratic political event, when she was in the restaurant, they treated her like a servant. They would either look through her or be dismissive, but it's just like, oh, she's just there to wait on them. And this has really stuck with me, this kind of attitude of disrespect that accompanies service work. And that how hard it is for service workers who are always supposed to smile and be happy and yet be treated with kind of constant kinds of like degradation and the expectation that they are always a little bit obsequious. Like I think it's completely damaging to our society. And so anyway, so we've got that option, or we have an option of equality and dignity, and everyone pulling together and being part of transforming the society into something that will be, survivable and flourish, and where we can flourish on a warming planet. So I think our choice is communism or neo-feudalism. In neo-feudalism, most of us are serfs.
I've got an Alexa going off here, so just a sec, but I do have a question for you. Okay.
One more way the Lords impede into everything we do.
No kidding. I was just going to ask about the international level. Like a lot of our, we are in a service economy, but a lot of our economy relies on other parts of the world producing a bunch of cheap stuff, which we then consume. And of course, President Trump is trying to somehow reverse this and bring manufacturing back to the United States, which I agree with you is that's just not going to work. But do you kind of assume or envision that the same process that you have just described as kind of pushing us in the direction of more, collectivization or communism would also take place in the rest of the world? Or is there some sort of essential physical kind of grinding labor that still has to occur somewhere in the world in order for people living in high technology societies to have what they at least need in the way of food, and maybe some of these things that we use now?
To my mind, that's one of the most important questions, and I don't have great answers. That's my next project, is to try to think better about essentially about imperialism. And but let me start out a bit. The services are the primary employer, and by services now, including informal services and unpaid, right? But they're the primary employer in every sector, in every part of the world except the Middle East, where they're still in industry. That's from World Bank statistics. And so it's and a number of countries have moved directly from being primarily agrarian to being primarily services, which is kind of skipping the industrial phase altogether. And so a service approach will apply in more areas than one might think. So that's kind of point one. And I think it should apply in more areas than one might think. Because basically what it means is recognizing all of the different kinds of work that people are doing, and having an economy that actually remunerates that work and supports those people and treats all of that work with dignity, and then also organizes it so they don't have to do so much crappy aspects of the work. So that's the first thing. Second thing, yes, as long as there is humanity, there will be jobs that we don't like. And the question is going to be, how do we make sure that the distribution of those jobs is not done in ways that are raced, are sexed, that there are like they don't become a caste, that they're not primary to some people in the world. So let's say that we think that, just to be super hypothetical, lithium mining is going to be necessary for a tech economy. Well, this would mean that we have to make sure that the conditions of labor there are good conditions, are not immiserating and horrible. That if that the United States would be, if we're still in a phase where there's a global market in some ways, that the United States would be paying the way what those people need and deserve, not just trying to get, not just exploiting them, not just expropriating, not just using our power to take as much as we can. That would be one way through it. But I actually think that the biggest challenge for communism is what does it mean on a global level, right? We have to get rid of imperialism. But what really does that mean when we really think about the diversity of world cultures and to try to think about a kind of communist framework for all that? I'm not sure. I don't know, but I like thinking about that as a horizon for imagining a better future, because I think it's going to be necessary for a changing climate, right? The kinds of cooperation that we're going to need. Like our other alternative there is going to be like these resource wars over the rare minerals.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us about this and writing an excellent book. So.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad you were able to read it, and thanks for having me on. I was really happy to learn that you all had been thinking and talking about neo-feudalism for quite a while now, because I felt like I wasn't coming into a setting where people were just like, no, nah, it's always capitalism.
No, but back years ago, we didn't publish anything about it, but we read Work's Capital is Dead when it first came out.
Yeah.
And where I've been glad you validated my position that like, well, it doesn't sound like capital is dead, but it does seem like this is something worse.
Right. Exactly right. I think you're completely right on that. So again, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for being so right about that. And yeah, when you publish more, we'd love to have you back on. So.
Sure.